For more on the challenges facing Sri Lanka and what's next for the island nation, I'm joined now by Shanta Devarajan. Shanta is a Professor of International Development at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. Good to have you on the show. Now, we had a little bit of an overall insight into the situation in Sri Lanka in that package there, but could you tell us more about how Sri Lanka got here and what the major economic problems are?
Well, the main problem is that Sri Lanka has found itself to be out of foreign exchange, basically since about February of this year. Now, the reason they got there was a series of misguided policies by the Rajapaksa administration. They lowered taxes in November 2019, which increased the fiscal deficit and downgraded Sri Lanka's credit. The credit rating agencies downgraded Sri Lanka's credit, so that Sri Lanka could no longer borrow from capital markets. But what they did, instead of going for a debt restructuring and an IMF program, they spent the next 2 years paying back the debt out of their reserves. So they ran out of reserves. And now we're faced with shortages of food and fuel and pharmaceuticals, all the things that you need foreign exchange to buy. They don't have foreign exchange, so they can't buy it. And these shortages, therefore, are what's creating the anger and the resentment of people, as some of the people you interviewed in the earlier part. So these people squarely blame the Rajapaksa administration for their plight. But that doesn't mean that when Rajapaksa goes, that the debt will also go away, because the debt problem still has to be solved. And that's what we are working on right now in trying to reach an agreement with the IMF and trying to obtain a restructuring of the debt so the amount of money they have to pay back will be less. And I think that can proceed despite the political unrest and uncertainty in Colombo, in the sense that those discussions are going on at the technical level, say between the central bank governor and the Secretary of the Treasury in Sri Lanka and their counterparts at the IMF. And they're likely to reach an agreement at the staff level about the IMF program in the next few weeks. It's probably going to take another 3 months before they're ready to go to the IMF board.
Your analysis seems consistent with just about every economist that I've heard in terms of this topic, but the government in Sri Lanka blames the lack of tourism thanks to the pandemic, that they don't have the foreign reserves because they don't have that essential resource from the tourist trade. Do you think there's anything to that?
Yes, the COVID pandemic did cause the tourist industry to come crashing down. But what that did was exacerbate the mistakes that the Sri Lankan government made. And I would say that President Gotabaya Rajapaksa himself admitted that it was a mistake not to go to the IMF 2 years ago. He actually said those very words. So I think the government itself realizes that the original mistake was theirs in terms of policy, but the COVID pandemic and now the Ukraine war are exacerbating those problems for Sri Lanka.
You started to get into it a little bit, but tell us more about what needs to happen at this point. Of course, a government is pretty important right now, but once we get past that, what are some of the structural implications that this country needs to take, and how will it impact people's everyday lives? Are we talking about raising taxes? How is that going to impact people's lives, for example?
Well, the program that we're trying to negotiate are essentially trying to reverse those misguided policies that the Rajapaksa administration implemented 2 years ago. So we are going to raise taxes, whereas they previously cut taxes. There will probably be reductions in some of the subsidies that are essentially going to the rich. And a very important part of the program is a set of cash transfers that are targeted to the bottom 40% of the population, so that they are cushioned. They are the people that we need to protect in this situation. So the program, on the one hand, is what you might call an austerity program, but we're trying to make sure that it's not extreme austerity for the poor, who are the ones who are most vulnerable.
Well, especially when there's $50 billion worth of debt in Sri Lanka. The World Bank has agreed to loan Sri Lanka $600 million. China and India are in talks about more money to loan too. How does a country get out of bad debt with more debt? How does that work? And what kind of risks are we looking at too?
That's precisely what we're working on right now, because we're working on a reduction in that debt. That's what a debt restructuring is. So there are negotiations going on with the creditors, both the private sector creditors as well as the official creditors like China, India, and Japan, to work out a level of debt that is lower than what it is now so that Sri Lanka can pay it back. That's what is needed at the moment, because at the moment they can't pay back the existing level of debt. But you asked about the effect of all of this on the people. Well, I think while these austerity programs will cause them to tighten their belts, if we reach an agreement with the IMF, this can actually bring in new money, fresh money, including about $800 million from the IMF, about $1 billion from the World Bank, $1 billion from the Asian Development Bank. This can help to relieve the foreign exchange constraint that has been so debilitating up to now. And so people might see some relief at the same time as the implementation of this program.
Really interesting to get your insight. Thank you so much for your time. Shanta Devarajan, Professor of International Development at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service.
Thank you.
Meanwhile,